caste, race, and capital should be studied, and what kind of questions it is possible to raise at this particular moment in time about the interlocking systems of caste, race, and capital. And this is, of course, not an unstudied topic by any means, but I would like to start by pointing out that most often the study of the interactions between caste and race or caste and capital takes place in a very situated contextual manner, looking at specific points of intersection between these experiences largely. And I want to shift away from that a little bit and think about caste, race, and capital as interlocking systems, as structural forces that are global and are, present at a planetary scale across different phenomenon and different contexts. So the study of these forces should kind of correspond to that reality. And I propose to do this by using the framing of 3 migrations. And each of these migrations, as you will see, is already established in terms of their scale and significance, and they are all kind of individually studied. But I want to bring them together into this framing of trying to study the entanglements of caste, race, and capital. Before I start talking about the migration stories, I want to do a very, very short, quick recap of the literature that is already out there. So there has been a long-standing debate between the relationship between race and caste, and somewhat surprisingly, but also not so surprisingly, a lot of it comes to us from the US academic literature on race. And there are broadly 2 kind of standpoints. So one of the standpoints comes to us from the tradition of Oliver Cox, who was a Trinidadian American political theorist and wrote this book called Caste, Class, and Race. And broadly in that tradition of analysis, the argument is that we should not use caste as a frame of analysis to understand race relations in the US, because it obfuscates, it takes the attention away from the active processes of racialization that the colonial knowledge structure imposes, and the histories of racial capitalism that flow from that knowledge structure and the materialities that the knowledge structure enables. And so it's a stand against the use of the vocabulary of caste to understand race relations in the US. And this tradition continues, there are lots of sort of anti-racist, Black materialist, Marxist scholars who continue in this tradition of Cox. And then on the other side of this debate, we have a standpoint, the latest instantiation of which was Isabel Wilkerson's book called Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents. And earlier prominent theorists of this have been, for example, Gunnar Myrdal, where the argument is that, well, caste provides us the sort of underlying structure on which race is imposed. So it kind of wants to emphasize on the socially constructed nature of race. And to do that, it makes the claim that what is underlying all of this is the idea of caste, which is the broad idea of a hierarchy of status, and which then corresponds to the hierarchy of material well-being and political power and agency in society and so forth. But it is that underlying structure on which the myth and the fiction of race is mounted. And Wilkerson in her book draws a clear kind of parallel between the hierarchy of white, both kind of racially white, but also white-collared people in USA as parallel to the Brahmins in India, and then mixed race and various categories that get subsumed within the category of brown as the mid-ranking castes, and then the African-American community and other Black people in USA as comparable to the Dalits in India. And this has, of course, come under some critique. And the main line of critique, again, in the continuation of Cox's idea, is that this is a very ahistorical, dislocated, non-situated understanding. And I want to quote here from, this is from Cherry's Burden-Stelly's review of the book Caste, of Wilkerson's book Caste, in the Boston Review of Books, where she says, to be sure, there is a reason why caste has an enduring appeal as a framework to explain the organization of US society. It offers a convenient explanation for the ongoing violence and discrimination against racialized peoples while avoiding biological conceptions of race, which we are often reminded is a social construct. Caste can be readily employed as shorthand for all forms of subjection emanating from systems of caste, class, and racism, regardless of history, context, geography, and form. And while I am largely in agreement with her argument here, I also want to point out certain critiques of both Cox and his interlocutors, as well as anti-caste scholars from India, to kind of segue into my framing of the three migration stories. So in India, for example, one of the most, probably the most prominent anti-caste intellectual is Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who was also the chairperson of the Constituent Assembly. So in some ways, he's given the authorship of the Constitution of India, and an extremely prominent figure politically, both in the anti-colonial movement and in the anti-caste movement, and continues to be the sort of fountainhead of intellectual inspiration for anti-caste activists and scholars even today. And I want to point out that both Cox and Ambedkar are quintessentially modernist thinkers who were writing at a time when our knowledge of the post-colony or the soon-to-become post-colony was very much defined and structured by the colonial narratives about the post-colony. And it is in this setting that both Cox and Ambedkar were writing. And so we see certain statements and arguments coming from both of them, which are easily refuted today. So for instance, Cox writes that one of his claims that continues to be upheld by many in his tradition is that there was no sort of anti-caste resistance in the subcontinent, in the Indian subcontinent, and this makes caste an institution of social consensus, and it's not an inherently racialized one, whereas there has always been an anti-racist resistance to the operation of race and to the imposition of racialization. And this obviously can be easily refuted today because we have Dalit intellectuals and Dalit historians and Bahujan historians active in the academy, writing against this narrative and showing us that actually anti-caste resistance has also always been present, both during the colonial time as well as before that. And it's just not been acknowledged and not been written into the canonical histories of the subcontinent. So that's one aspect of it. On the other hand, we have Ambedkar writing, for example, in his book, The Emancipation of the Untouchables, which came out in 1942, where he says that the fate of the Dalits in India is perhaps even worse than the African Americans or the Jews of Germany, which in today's context, with the privilege of everything that we know of in the interim years, it's difficult to stand by that statement or to even stand by that particular approach of framing comparable oppressions or non-comparable oppressions. And so I just want to make the point that writers like Cox and Ambedkar are writing in a certain political setting, and there is a very explicit political aim to the writing. They're writing to strategize for a resistance movement. And this needs to be kept in mind. And so we need to see the existing literature around the entanglement of race and caste and also capital within that context, and not as some kind of universal generalizable proclamations about the nature of caste and race and their relationship to capital. So that brings me to the first migration story that I want to emphasize on. And I argue that this is an important bit of the puzzle of the entanglement of race, caste, and capital that we have sort of overlooked in our academic pursuits so far. And it also shows that caste has in fact been racialized for a very long time, and that as things are poised today, it is likely to be racialized even more. So this migration story is about a migration that solidified around the second millennium BC, so about 4,000 years ago. But our understanding of this migration has been recently rejuvenated by advances made in archaeology and in genetic science. And these two books that you see here on the slide are two kind of prominent interventions in popular culture and popular discourse around the use of genetic science and our understanding of ancestry and caste society that are kind of shaping the popular discourse, or in the media at least, to a very large extent. So in this particular story of migration, what we learn from the latest developments in genetic science is that there has been, technological advancement that now allows archaeologists and geneticists to not only access very, very ancient human skeletons and human remains, organic remains, but also to extract sufficient quantities of genetic material from that to be able to code it and map it and compare it to genetic samples collected from current population groups. And through this, one of the major findings that scientists have put forward, and this came out in the Nature about maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and it had several authors, about 90 different authors from various institutes across the world, starting from Harvard to the Indian National Institute of Genetic Scientific Research. And their main claim is that the entire population of South Asia today is some form of a mixed population. And they identify 3 sort of population groups that have contributed to this mixture. And they come up with categories such as ancient ancestral North Indian DNA and ancient ancestral South Indian DNA. And the claim is that there are 3 groups of populations. One is the ancestral South Indian population, which is closest to the current native inhabitants of the Andaman Islands, often referred to as tribal or aboriginal in the colonial vocabulary, and have close connections to other populations further to the east and East Asia. And then there are 2 other population groups, one that migrated from Iran, from present-day Iran, who were largely agriculturalists, and then another group that migrated from the steppes of Central Asia, who were largely pastoralists. And this claim sort of upends the theory of looking at Hindustan or South Asia as an Aryan homeland. And this idea of the Aryan homeland comes to us from what is today referred to as Hindutva or Hindu nationalist ideology, which was also very prominent and played a large role in shaping the discourse around the anti-colonial movement in India. And one of their main claims is that the upper caste, and I use upper and lower here very much in quotes, clearly signifying my disidentification with that way of hierarchy. But they refer to the upper castes as the original inhabitants and of the subcontinent, and therefore the subcontinent as the homeland, and they claim racial supremacy or superiority by claiming Aryan inheritance. And this, of course, this study appends that. But at the same time, it does give to us these categories of ancestral North Indian and ancestral South Indian, which has repercussions for how we go about thinking about caste. And I want to allude here to Alondra Nelson's work on the social life of the DNA, where she talks about race reparations and reconciliation after the genome, where she makes the claim that while it is well established in USA, for example, that race is obviously a social construct, it has kind of made that transition from a sociological category to a biological category with advances in genetic science and with the increasing popularity of genetic scientific testing and ancestry tracing amongst the African Black descendants of American chattel slavery. And while this has certain kind of emancipatory and reconciliatory aspects to it as well, it also has this disconcerting aspect of turning race into a biological reality. And we already see some of this manifesting in the South Asian context. For example, this is an article that came out in the media in India just a few weeks ago, around the end of August, that says a genetic study connects Konkan Roman Catholics to Gaur Saraswat Brahmins. And this is really significant because we are talking here about genetic science, and the same institutions that were involved in the previous study that I mentioned are the ones that are involved in this study as well. And one of their agendas in genetic science in India is to map the genetic profiles of specific cultural or ethnic or linguistic groups, such as the Konkan Roman Catholics and the Gaur Saraswat Brahmins, which closely overlap with caste groups, if not explicitly, then definitely implicitly. And this one particularly has repercussions for how we think about caste in the subcontinent, because the Indian state from its very inception in 1947 has maintained that a Dalit Christian is not an ontologically coherent category, because once you adopt Christianity or once you adopt Islam, you cease to belong to a caste group. So you cannot identify as Dalit Christian and Dalit Muslim. And based on this logic, which comes to us from the Hindu nationalist logic of Christianity and Islam being foreign religions, which is then mobilized to deny affirmative action benefits to Dalit Christians. And various studies show us that while Christians themselves are about 1 to 1.5% of the population in the subcontinent, a vast majority of them, some studies claim about 90%, are Dalit converts. And so they are obstructed from accessing their constitutionally mandated affirmative action benefits because of their religion. And on the other hand, here, an arm of the state, this Genetic Research Institute, has no qualms in accepting that it is possible to be both Roman Catholic and Gaur Saraswat Brahmin. And so there is a clear kind of ontological disruption here about the nature of caste and whether caste ceases to exist with conversion. And somehow we can see that the standards are different when it comes to Brahmins and when it comes to Dalits. So this is something that I think will continue to shape and refine our understanding of the migration story, one, but it obviously also has very far-reaching implications for what we think about caste and race and the racialization of caste in the present times. I'll move on now to migration story 2. And this is, again, something that has been written about to a certain extent and is becoming a sort of more emerging field of work, which is indenture studies. And recently, I think last year, the first journal dedicated to indenture studies was started. And there's an increasing number of scholars, apart from historians have been looking at this for a while, but also geographers and sociologists who are also taking interest in the history of indenture. So Migration Story 2 is the story of colonial indenture. And I want to here acknowledge the work of Radhika Saraf, who is a PhD candidate here at the India Institute and has been assisting me with this aspect of the research. And following her formulation, I will refer to Migration Story 2 as the story of caste and coolitude, which is the story of colonial indenture. So the history of indenture, I think, provides us with a crucial site and a crucial milestone in thinking about, or in rethinking, reimagining the entanglement of caste and capitalism. Because indenture was a practice of labor migration that was crafted through the collusion of private capital and the colonial state machinery. There's very clear and established archival evidence for this, that in the aftermath of the abolition of slavery, this was a very kind of well thought out mechanism that was put in place by the colonial bureaucracy to help private capitalists, colonial capitalists, in other parts of the Commonwealth to source cheap and easily available labor through very extractive terms. And in terms of the numbers that we are looking at, between 1834 and 1920, which was the period when indenture was sort of officially alive and kicking, about 2 million people, men, women, and children from South Asia were trafficked as indentured labor migrants to various parts of the colony, from the Caribbean in the west to the Fiji Islands in the east. And there was also a collusion of different empires within this. So the British Empire, for example, would loan out indentured migrants to other empires such as the French and the Portuguese. And this labor was mainly used for plantation work in plantations, producing commodities such as sugar, tea, rubber, cocoa, all of which are sort of foundational commodities in the history of racial capitalism, in the history of what Gurminder Bhamra calls the colonial global economy, which is the precursor to the capitalist development and global capitalist economy that we know of today. So in the study of indenture, there are a few kind of figures and tropes that are quite prominent. One is that of the Jahaji Bhai. And Jahaji Bhai, which literally means the brotherhood of the ship, refers to this phenomenon where those who undertook these voyages together, often not knowing the extent or the distance or the circumstances under which the voyage is going to be undertaken, formed these lifelong brotherhoods or associations that continued to thrive in the colony or at the plantation, and often had this intergenerational form where children of Jahaji brothers were forbidden from marrying each other because they were considered to be blood family. And I also want to acknowledge here the work of Maria del Pilar Caladin, who has made a very interesting kind of extension of the Jahaji brother trope to the Windrush generation, where descendants of indenture also then again took another voyage, another colonial migration to the colonial center. And these sorts of relationships continue to thrive and do still thrive today in the UK and elsewhere. But what this does, this Jahaji Bhai trope, what it has kind of established in the literature is that it managed to loosen the ties of caste or the restrictions of caste, and there was a sort of intercaste solidarity that emerged. And while not a lot is known about it, I think there are important lessons to be learned here about the possibilities of intercaste solidarity and about the possibilities of the reality of moving beyond caste restrictions or abolishing caste in some senses in the formation of a new society, if you will. But this also keeps the focus on the aspect of indenture that comes with the voyage and after the end of the voyage, after the arrival in the plantation. And I want to go back a bit and say that we need to also focus on the process of recruitment for indenture. And in this literature, which mostly comes from historians in South Asia, we see a predominance of the figure of the intermediary. So most of the literature is around this figure of the intermediary. And the intermediary in the case of indenture migration from South Asia to the Caribbean was referred to as the Sardar. And for those migrating from South Asia to East Asia, to Southeast Asia, were referred to as Kanganis and Mestris. I'm going to focus a little bit here on the literature on Kanganis and Mestris because that one delves a little bit more into questions of caste than the literature on Sardars. So the historical consensus here is that Kanganis and Mestris were essentially returning plantation workers who were then involved in recruiting more workers, and they kind of followed the workers through the entire life cycle of the process. So from recruitment to accompanying them on the voyage to actually overseeing the work done by them in the plantations. And these were usually members who came from mid-ranking agrarian castes, and they recruited overwhelmingly from either castes of the same status or of lower status. And a lot of this recruitment took place from areas that are now referred to as the tribal heartland. So the Chota Nagpur Plateau states that are now in eastern India. And most of this recruitment took place on the basis of kinship ties and on the basis of debt bondage. So one of the things that is different with the Kanganis and Mestris compared to the Sardars is that they also loaned money to the indentured workers to undertake the voyage. Whereas for the Sardars, the voyage was paid for by the colonial state because they had sort of more solid systems in place. And so this debt bondage continued into the plantation work. And there is a small but growing literature about the kind of nature of the relationship between the overseer or the intermediary and them as the intermediary between capital and labor. And so the claim being made by labor historians is that Indian mid-ranking caste individuals were intermediaries between colonial capital and native labor. And I want to push this a bit further and say that actually what this tells us is that caste was a mediating force between capital and labor. And so the force of caste, the structural element of caste, makes it possible for the story of racial capitalism to unfold in the way that it has unfolded today and the way that we know of it today. And of course, this has to be backed up with more archival research and other kinds of research. But I think this is one of the kind of expanding horizons for us to study the relationship between caste and capital and labor. Humaira, how am I doing on time?
So yes, I was about to remind you that maybe another 3 minutes.
Yeah,
max.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. I'm going to quickly move on then to Migration Story 3. But first, a quick nod to how Migration Story 1 and Migration Story 2 are quickly overlapping nowadays. So there is a growing industry of Caribbean Trinidadian families, or even those from East Asia, trying to trace back their ancestral heritage to India. And of course, I actually know of people in the UK who are descendants of Indenture, who have taken genetic testing to find out what part of India their family originally came from. And while right now it is still at the level of which part, it's still at the level of geography, I don't think it is, very far in the future that it will become at the level of biology, where you can actually make claims to a certain caste status. And it remains to be seen what that does to the conversation about caste, and how open or closed, the caste society in India will be to those kinds of claims. But it is something that I think is definitely on the cards. So finally, coming to migration story 3, I think this is the one that most of us are probably most familiar with and that we know the most about. And I certainly include myself in this kind of migration, which is the migration of relatively elite caste individuals from the subcontinent to various parts of the colonial center, I would say, which includes Euro-America, UK, and also to some extent Australia. Through the period of late colonialism, so from the 1900s onwards to the continuing contemporary times, so both in the late colonial and early post-colonial and ongoing period of time. And here I want to point out one of the cases from 1913, which again gives us a very kind of succinct glance into the racialization of caste and the relationship between caste, race, and capital. So this is the case of Bhagat Singh Thind, who in 1913 arrived in USA. And he was a Sikh subject of British India, and he belonged to the caste of Rajputs, which is considered to be a high-ranking caste. And he had also served in the British Army during the First World War, and then he received an education in the USA, and then he decided to apply for citizenship, which at that time was only restricted to white people of good character, according to the law. And Thind makes the case that he should be given US citizenship because he's a high-ranking upper caste Hindu and therefore of Aryan heritage. And this case has been reported on a fair bit. As you can see, this is a report from the Teen Vogue publication that came out in 2019, I think. So it's very much there in popular culture now. And most of the time, the case is used to demonstrate the racist origins of US citizenship, which of course it does demonstrate. And Thind lost the case. He was not made a US citizen on these grounds. But I want to argue here that this also tells us something about the racialization of caste and the relationship between caste and race. And this kind of this intellectual, there's an intellectual continuity between the argument that Thind was making and many of the arguments that we see in the popular discourse today, coming from elite caste South Asians who have gained a certain level of prominence and power and agency and voice in the colonial center. And I'm going to end with a couple of examples. So one, I think many of us might be aware of it in 2010, or a bit after that, maybe 2014 or so, there was a parliamentary committee in the UK that was carrying out, discussions about whether or not caste should be included in the Equalities Act of 2010, and if caste should be one of the characteristics on which discrimination can be recognized. And there was a concerted effort from upper caste groups here in the UK against that, which was in a way successful because caste was not included specifically, explicitly as a protected characteristic, but it was seen as an aspect of racial discrimination. So that's one example. Another example is from very, very recent times, earlier this year, when about 90 Dalit men were rescued from a temple site in New Jersey. And it was revealed that they had been kept there under kind of circumstances of modern age slavery with very, very low wages and forced to work in temple construction. And the overlaps that we see here between this example and the history of indenture are really startling, but haven't been interrogated enough. So, for instance, many of these Dalit men did not read English and were made to sign contracts that were written in English, which was one of the most commonly used mechanisms of oppression against indentured labor at the time of indenture. Then they were brought over on visas that were meant for specialist religious work, and they were essentially doing manual work, and they were prohibited from leaving the site, and they were prohibited from interacting with people outside of that temple complex. And this again brings us back to anti-abandonment laws that were present at plantation systems across the colony, where there were stringent measures taken against indentured workers deserting their plantation work and moving on to other sources of better paid labor, or even trying to escape the plantations. So I think these overlaps again tell us something about a long durée of a relationship between caste and capital, not just as intersecting forms of oppression, but as structural forces at a global scale. And I think we need to interrogate that further going ahead. So I'll stop with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Srilata. That was a really fascinating and a very rich discussion that you packed into a very small amount of time. So the floor is open now to questions, and as people collect their thoughts, maybe I'll start with, you ended actually and partially answered my question, but perhaps I can push you to say a bit more schematic, in a slightly more schematic manner, the overarching question that drives these the three migration stories and the way that you see them as being connected. So is it that caste has, in a sense, provided the blueprint or the framework for racialized capitalism? Because I thought I heard you say that at one point. Or is it that caste and capital and race come together in contingent ways, and it's interesting to just explore the contingent ways in which they come together? Is it that? Is it much more open-ended for you? Or is it a slightly more pointed kind of going in a particular direction with the idea that actually caste has provided a kind of a framework or a blueprint that racialized capitalism has built upon or developed? I mean, I'm open to both, but I thought I heard both stories in your narrative, and I wondered which one was the overarching question for you.
Sure. Should I answer straight away, or do we collect questions?
Yeah, let's go with that, and we can then take more questions.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah, I think, I'm a bit hesitant actually to say that caste gives us the blueprint or the underlying structure, because then I think we run that risk of talking about caste in these kind of, very fluffy, out there way that is not grounded in anything specific. So I am definitely interested in a grounded, historically specific, geographically specific understanding of caste as something that originated in the South Asian subcontinent and has a certain religious sanction and a certain history and a certain, a theological sanction to it, and has connotations for how economic relations are organized and how labor relations are organized. So in that sense, yes, caste is sort of a driving logic through everything. In terms of the organization of society, labor, economics, politics, all of that, but it's not ahistorical or ageographical. So that that's kind of my starting point. In terms of a question, I haven't formulated it properly yet, but I think what I want to be able to argue, or what I want to create an evidence base for, is the claim that caste, it's not just a cultural aspect that's restricted to South Asia and does not have relevance elsewhere in the world, and two, that it's a fundamental force. It's as much of a shaping element as capital, as race. So it hasn't been acknowledged as such, and it hasn't been studied as such, but it needs to be. So I think my aim in that sense is probably to kind of excavate caste from the histories of racial capital, if you will. Yeah, that's where I'm at at the moment.
Great, thank you. No, that sounds really exciting and very ambitious, which is great, right? I mean, I think ambitious projects are always fun to work with. So let me open up. If you want to raise your hand, then please use the raise hand function to ask a question. I can't yet see any questions. Lawrence.
Many thanks, Srilata. That was fantastic. I think that this is a fascinating project. What little I know about it is related to the experience, particularly of Durban and Johannesburg in relation to this, and the way that caste and indentured labor played itself out there historically and still plays itself out. But that's not really the point of my question. I wanted to ask a little bit more about Ambedkar and how he fitted into the story. You spoke quite quickly about him being a kind of fountainhead of an anti-caste position, and then put him alongside Cox. And I just wanted to, I didn't get the full picture of how you'd fit him in to your story, as it were, particularly as regards his specific positions against, or his specific anti-caste positions. Not, a lot of which weren't worked through and didn't come out successfully, but are there in his writings.
Yeah. So I think it's impossible to work on caste without acknowledging Ambedkar. And, in the same way that, Marx is acknowledged or Foucault is acknowledged in the academy today, I would like Ambedkar to have a similar position of prominence where, people have to, whether you agree or disagree with some of his positions, you would have to acknowledge, the existence of that body of work, which is a considerable body of work. But I think there are some, inherent kind of contradictions if we are to think about the Ambedkarite anti-caste position and the ways in which we think about intersectionality and intersectional social justice today. I've spoken a little bit about this in some of my previous work, but essentially the point I'm making is that Ambedkar, writing at the time that he was writing and under the circumstances that he was writing, he believed he was a modernist. He believed in the project of modernization, and so he wanted, for example, Dalits to learn English, Dalits to go to college, to dress, in a Western way, and to reject the system and the narratives that were imposing their subalternity on them. And to do this, it was imperative for him to have Dalits participate in the project of modernity. And I think one of the speakers earlier in the series, Doipayan Shane, he's worked a lot about this, about the involvement of Dalits in actually carrying out the census operations during the making of the colonial knowledge structure. And the census, as we know, in most of the scholarship, the post-colonial critical scholarship, we look at the census as this instrument that was used to solidify differences and solidify categories that don't fit, and essentially as this colonial remnant that is better kind of critiqued than actually utilized. But Ambedkar and Dalit populations at that time were using these processes of colonization, the processes of modernity, to resist caste oppression. So I think we need to acknowledge that. And I think we need to find ways to reconcile that with the kind of work that we want to do today in terms of understanding racialization as a process of coloniality and understanding caste as also, feeding into that process, or, trying to make use of that process somehow. So yeah, I don't know if that clarifies it a little bit, but I think I definitely want to, refer to Ambedkar and, refer to that body of work. But I also want to, position it in a certain time and to a certain end. He was at the end of the day writing as a political strategist for an anti-caste movement. And if we want to use that as theory, for example, then, what other things do we need to do to make it work? Yeah. So that's how I see Ambedkar fitting into my thinking about anti-caste scholarship in the world today.
Thank you. I mean, I guess that's partly a problem that would come up with any political thinker, especially political thinkers from the global south, because they were also political actors. So Gandhi also had, a particular concern and political project. Nehru did too, and so did Ambedkar. So in that sense, I'm not sure why that caveat, to follow on from Lawrence's question, I'm not sure why that caveat should hold more for Ambedkar than for the others. Or is that what you're suggesting? Or is it are you just saying that all political thinkers are always political actors and we just need to recognize that? Or are you saying that Ambedkar has specific limitations that we need to think through?
No, I think I would go ahead and put the caveat for everyone, although we're not used to doing that in the way we do academic scholarship at the moment. But yeah, I would like to use that caveat for everyone, but also specifically in terms of thinking about caste and race. I'll give you an example. I attended this talk by a very prominent, popular Ambedkarite anti-caste activist who said we should not equate race and caste, and we should not let race subsume caste, because the project of anti-caste struggle is to end caste, while the project of anti-racist struggle is to end racism, but not race. And I wanted to say that is absolutely not true. The project is very much to end race as well. It's just that you cannot end race without ending racism first. And in the same way, if you are able to see the anti-caste project in terms of, that kind of like a structural upheaval altogether, where you end caste and not just caste discrimination, you should also be able to see the project of anti-racism as as wanting to end as an ontological intervention, like end the idea of race altogether. But it becomes very difficult, especially in this context of genetic science and these kinds of categorizations that genetic science uses. In that context, it becomes very difficult to imagine those political ends. And so I think it's important to put those caveats and keep reminding people that just because Ambedkar said that this is how anti-caste and anti-race projects are different doesn't mean that actually holds today. The ends might be same, and the ends might have shifted since then. So yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. So let me check if there are any more hands in this section. Yeah.
If I
go ahead, Lawrence. Yes, Lawrence.
If I could just thanks. That was really fascinating, and I fully agree. I had another question as well that I thought you might be able to make more of, and that was that the point you made in your second migration story around the possibilities of intercaste solidarity that came out of your discussion of the brotherhood of the ship and the intermediaries, etc. I thought that was really fascinating because, of course, that's potentially turning your argument on its head, as it were. In other words, the movement of peoples through indentured labor and other kinds of things is forced via colonial power structures and the capital therein, but it is having a kind of good unintended consequence in the sense that it's breaking down caste hierarchies and categories, and it's thereby, as you put it, generating the possibility for intercaste solidarity. So it would be quite interesting to see how, in the way that Amartya Sen does, I suppose, when he talks about markets, that there are sometimes positive consequences, unintended consequences that come out of these situations.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I have engaged with the historical literature on indenture enough to make any kind of definitive claims here. But from the limited interactions that I've had with scholars of indenture, I feel like caste is a little bit of a taboo topic to bring up in that kind of scheme of things, because the kind of established wisdom is that, well, that was just a cultural thing that was quickly overcome in light of the resistance and the resilience of the plantation workers. And I'm not entirely convinced of the empirical evidence of that. And I think that is where, a lot of the work needs to happen, because again, we don't have adequate empirical engagement with the processes of recruitment. And what was for example, the caste composition of the indentured migrants, and how did it come to be that way, and what is the nature of caste practices amongst the descendants of indenture, and even if they are not named as caste, do they kind of overlap with the practices in South Asia? How do we map those? How do we make sense of those? How do they make sense of that? So these things, I think, are very underexplored. So I don't think I can make any kind of definitive claims about that, but it definitely needs to be studied, because there is somewhat of a growing impetus amongst the descendants of indenture and communities in the Caribbean to veer towards Hindu nationalism. And what is attracting them to that, or how is it being pitched to make it attractive to them? Because Hindu nationalism is inherently a casteist ideology, and it very much comes to us from an upper caste supremacy perspective. So how is that being positioned to them, and how what is going on there? What is the political subjectivity that is being created there, is something that I would like to explore. But in the absence of all that empirical analysis, I think the basic idea that this shared experience of oppression gives rise to solidarity is something that is I can get behind that, and I can accept the analysis that yes, this happened, and this was at the crux of the resistance and the resilience of the indentured community, and continues to manifest in the way their societies are organized. And from that, I think it is possible to take lessons for, for example, internal migrant workers in South Asia today, who also come from, different caste groups, even if most of them are subaltern caste groups, but are of different status and have shared experiences of oppression, in under, capitalism and urbanization and so forth. And, what is the possibility of solidarity there is something that, could be understood through the experience of the Jahaji Bhais.
Thank you. So it looks like we have a very quiet audience group this particular seminar, and I can't see any further hands. But that actually makes it easier for me to ask another question that I wanted to push you a bit more on, Srilata. So precisely because there was so much in this presentation, and there were a lot of really interesting, it felt like asides, but they were not really asides as well. They were actually connected for you. So I wanted to come back to the question of genetics, and you started with that, right? You started with the role that genetics is generally beginning to play in our understanding of the history of ancient history, but also contemporary politics. And you wanted to connect those to say that in some ways, through this, as I heard you say it, in some ways, these genetic findings allow us to think about the overlap across groups that were thought to be previously distinct and different. But at the other end, what they also do is that the differences that they do recognize can become much more solidified and a bit more inscribed, more solidly inscribed. So what, first of all, to clarify if that is precisely what you were trying to say, and secondly, I see that these three migration stories can potentially come up together, and certainly genetics is another thread that seems to connect the three. But, why these three moments, or why these three stories, so to speak? And in fact, the first one is not really a moment, it's a very, very ancient history, but nevertheless, why we are in a sense comparing very different moments in history. It is no longer a genealogy in the Foucauldian sense of a genealogy. So what exactly are these three stories, and what role does genetics play across them for you?
Yeah, Thank you. Thanks very much for that. In terms of the genetic findings and the extent to which they consolidate differences, one of the things is that those who are, natural scientists, geneticists, and do not have a sort of critical social science perspective, they have, consistently maintained that the caste society gives us a great kind of empirical, data set, because these are endogamous groups that have remained endogamous over literally thousands of years. So it gives us like this ready-made, data bank to map and tap into. And in a way, it's very good for medical science because it, gives you very kind of easy answers for, probability of certain diseases and, how genes mutate and things like that. But, in this kind of impulse to validate endogamy and, these kind of static social categories, I think that leads to, one, the consolidation of, existing differences, but also a sort of encouragement to continue with, those consolidated differences. And in a way to kind of say that, oh look, because because there is already a lot of propaganda from the current regime, and generally in Hindu nationalist ideology there's a lot of propaganda about how caste is so scientific, and oh, it does exactly the right amount of genetic mixing because certain gotras or subcastes are not allowed to marry but others are allowed to marry. So this was all very well thought out by our ancestors, and therefore Hinduism is the most scientific religion. So I think the genetic science can unwillingly or unwittingly actually give legitimacy to that discourse in some ways, which can be extremely dangerous, of course, when there is already a growing amount of state repression on intercaste marriages, interreligious marriages, and like literal hounding and killing of individuals for marrying the wrong person. So yeah, so I think in terms of the genetic findings, like while it opens up a new frontier of investigation for us, especially in terms of understanding how caste has been racialized under Hindu nationalism, it also really pushes us into these kind of dangerous, terrain, dangerous zones of maintaining those differences, strengthening those differences, and not just differences, but very stringent hierarchies. So yeah, I think it's the double-sidedness of this that really intrigues me, and also because it is so palpable. It's every now and then you have new stories coming out about the next genetic testing and the next kind of group that has been genetically profiled. And I wonder if soon we will be in a time where you can take a blood test to prove your caste status, because there are already dating apps in India, for example, where you have to prove your caste status to be eligible to participate in that dating culture. So yeah, so that is why the genetic science aspect of it is really intriguing to me. And in terms of why these three stories, I think, so I'll be very honest, I came up with the idea of three migration stories because I realized that in trying to understand this whole field of caste, race, and capital, I realized that there were these three big migration waves that I keep running into through various. So if I try to study the genetic aspects of it, it somehow end up with the upper caste societies in USA, for example, that don't allow other castes to become members, and things like that. Like they will call themselves, for example, Telugu Association, which is it has to do with linguistic identity or cultural identity, but actually they are just a Telugu upper caste association, and they will not allow. Sujata Gidla writes about this in her memoir. It's called Ants Among Elephants. So she's a Dalit Telugu, and she was not allowed to become part of these associations because of that. So I kept encountering various aspects of these three migrations in trying to map out the literature and make sense of it. And so I just went with it, and it's very possible that this is not the ideal framing for this study, and I might have to revise it afterwards. But at the moment it feels like there are these kind of three big movements, global movements, which first of all highlight the global nature of the question, but also I can sort of see the links between the three as well, and the links are becoming clearer as we see things unfold in the world. And also there was something else that I just thought about and it escaped my mind. Sorry. I'll come back to it if I remember.
All right. Well, thank you very much. We are coming to the end of our time. So unless there are any last minute thoughts or questions from anybody else.
I saw something pop up in the chat box from Laura. Oh, she just says she's still absorbing this presentation, and your questions are great. I agree, Humaira, your questions have been really great, and I think they will really help me think about this in more nuanced ways and develop this idea, see how far it can go.
Well, it's an exciting idea. So thank you. Thanks to you, Srilata. Thanks to Lawrence and to the audience. Our next seminar is actually in a few weeks' time. It is with, let me pull it up. It's with Dr. Sifiwe Dube on 9th November. And we move once again to South Africa and debates around race in that context. So thank you all, and look forward to seeing you at that time. There's one, yes, and there's a question about a link to read more about your work, Srilata, and you might wish to provide that before I switch off. But thank you, everybody, and and see you in a few weeks' time.
Thanks. I'll just point everybody to the series called Confronting Caste, which I organized over the last term and will continue to organize. It's a series of podcasts and seminars where we talk about many of these topics. This work is unfortunately not yet published, but as soon as it is, you will get to know, I'm sure. But until then, please check out Confronting Caste. There's a YouTube channel, and it's also on the King's India Institute events page. So I hope to hear from you when you've listened to some of that. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.